Hello, welcome to the Writer's Craft here on Sparks 1524. I'm Nathaniel Miller. Crafting a great villain is just as important for your story as crafting a great hero. In fact, it might even be more important. The villain is often the force that drives the plot forward. The villain makes things happen. The villain also helps define the hero. Our heroes would not be very strong if they did not have to rise to the occasion of matching wits with a great villain. Captain Kirk would be the hero of a middling 1960s science fiction show if he did not have villains like Khan Noonien Singh to face off with during that show. In fact, Khan went from being a villain in a very memorable episode of that show to being the big bad of what is arguably the greatest Star Trek movie ever made, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Villains are entertaining because they get to do things that we never do and that we never would. The villain, none of us are going to pull out a gun. Well, I hope nobody watching this will pull out a gun and blast the head off that bugger who cuts us off on the interstate and almost causes us to get flattened by a semi. Hopefully none of you will do that. I know I never will. But our villains in literature, they get to do those kind of things. So in a symbolic way, it's a little cathartic for us to watch a good villain. Not to mention that good villains are also just flat out entertaining. The Joker, when he is performed correctly, is an absolute hoot of a character, be it Mark Hamill doing voice work for him in the Batman and Justice League animated series, Jack Nicholson's perfect, spot-on comic book portrayal of the Joker in 1989, or Heath Ledger's absolutely brilliant portrayal of what the Joker would be if he were in the real world in The Dark Knight. And that's just a couple of villains, Khan and the Joker. There are plenty of other villains. Look at your favorite movies, look at your favorite TV shows, read your favorite novels. Even in history, we love a good villain. The Nazis are a great villain, or a great set of villains for stories set during the 1930s and 40s because as an organization, as a movement, they stood for really horrendous things. Their motivations were strong, deep, and almost religious, and those motivations drove them to become a great threat to the rest of, not just Western civilization, but the entire world. But you got to think about the villain carefully as you think about the hero. Now, the next few episodes of The Writer's Craft, both here on my YouTube channel and in my written columns, will be focusing on what I consider to be the 5 categories you really have to craft a great villain. First off, the villain is a character. Therefore, they must behave like a human being, or at least consistent with whoever their character is. If they're an alien in science fiction, then they have to behave consistently with that race of beings that they're part of. Now, behaving consistently as a character doesn't mean you behave normally. Referencing the Joker again. He clearly doesn't behave normally. The man is psychotic. Harley Quinn, she's kind of evolved from a villain to an anti-hero. But she's still insane. She behaves in a very outlandish fashion. But for her character, that's the correct behavior. The villain has to behave believably. The villain has to be a real person as much as the hero. Another thing you have to think about is that the villain must have clear motivations. Excuse me. A villain that's just slogging through with brute force for no reason other than to be a brute force is boring. One of the complaints I had back in the 1990s with the Death of Superman series in the comic books was that Doomsday, the monster that kills Superman, was nothing but a juggernaut of destruction for the sake of being a juggernaut of destruction. It wasn't until years later, many issues later, once Superman had been resurrected, that a backstory for Doomsday was developed, which explained his motivations for the rampage and the fight with Superman. But during the event itself, there was no backstory. There was nothing but this monster rampaging across the countryside that never developed into anything but a monster rampaging across the countryside. He had no clear motivation. I don't care how big an event the Death of Superman was. I stopped reading it because I got bored. Without the villain having motivations, with him just being a threat of brute violence for no reason, what's the point? The villain has to be your hero's opposite number. They could be kind of a literal opposite number, like Moriarty is to Holmes. They're both very meticulous, very high functioning, genius level intellect men who are only separated by a moral code. Or the villain could be a thematic opposite. The Joker is not quite as smart as Batman, but the Joker is Batman's thematic opposite. Batman represents order, the Joker represents chaos. So they still have to mesh together because the villain and the hero are opposite gears in the same machine, so they have to be able to mesh. Therefore, the villain must somehow be the hero's opposite number. The villain also has to win occasionally. This is important. Even in a one-off novel where that particular villain is going to get incarcerated or killed or whatever, they still have to present a believable threat, or what's the point? Now, if the villain's going to be a recurring villain, then they really have to win big time a few times to be believable. But even in a one-off novel, the villain has got to have a few victories to raise the stakes. It could be something as simple as the villain is trying to kill somebody and the hero is racing to save that person and just gets there a little too late. The villain wins and this person is dead. Either way, the villain has to present a real threat, or again, like I said, what's the point? Big deal. Who cares? Finally, and this one is the most fun, the villain has got to be cool. Now, cool doesn't mean necessarily likable. Cool doesn't necessarily mean somebody you'd root for. Although, let's be honest, some of us sometimes root for the villains at least a little, because again, in a symbolic way, it's a kind of cathartic to see the villain do things we'd like to do, but actually never would. But in this context, cool means entertaining. There's not much likable about Darth Vader. That's why he's a great villain. But from the moment he steps on the screen, we're riveted to Darth Vader. George Lucas went out of his way to make Vader the classic villain. Everything from being an extremely tall person, dressed all in black, big robes, a cape to make him look even bigger and more magnificent, that iron mask that prevents us from seeing his face, and the deep voice, much less that weird mechanical breathing. All those things combine to make Vader a very entertaining villain to watch, in addition to the fact he had one of the greatest opening scenes ever, one of the greatest introductions. This rebel ship is getting beat all to hell by the Empire. Our rebels are being shot dead all around us, and out of the smoke walks Vader, just quietly, looks around, and walks on, and yet you knew from his size, his appearance, and the manner of his introduction that this is a force to be reckoned with, and he's going to be a lot of fun to watch. So the villain's got to be cool. They've got to be entertaining. In my opinion, these 5 things are the traits that make great villains, and all the great villains have these to some degree. So, for the next as we go forward here on Sparks 1524, the next few Writer's Craft episodes will be discussing how to write a great villain for your story. And each of the next videos and columns on the written side will be examining one of those 5 categories and villains that worked and villains that didn't work because that factor was successfully employed or that factor failed. So, as we go forward now, of course, there are other episodes and other subjects here, so the next few weeks may not be a straight Writer's Craft, but that's the joy. It's, this channel is like a Cracker Jack box. You got to tune in to see what you get sometimes. But we will be discussing that over the next few weeks, and I look forward to you joining me. And if you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to drop a comment here. I'll be happy to respond. It might take a little time because I am a one-man band. Crafting a great villain is as critical as crafting a great hero. Maybe more so because in many ways the villain is the one who's going to drive the plot. The villain gets things moving because the hero is out trying to stop the villain from whatever their dastardly plan is. So until next time, look at the villains that you like. Why did they stick with you? Analyze the factors that connect all those villains and make them believable and memorable. The worst thing that can happen to any of us who are writers is that we create something that is forgettable. If you enjoyed this video, again, please drop a comment if you have any suggestions or ideas or just want to get a dialogue going about great villains and writing in general. If you want to read more about this, check out my written column, which is linked below in the description. Please hit that little like button and feel free to share this if you think it'll help anybody out. I thank you for your time, and until we meet again here on Sparks 1524, have a great day, have a great weekend, and remember to go and do great things.